On this episode of China Uncensored, Xi Jinping is hosting the annual BRICS summit, and he's proving that she's a BRICS house. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm your host, Chris Chappell. This week was the annual BRICS summit in Xiamen, China. It's a meeting between the world's largest developing economies: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Personally, I think they should have gone with SPRIC, or maybe brisk. That's brisk, baby. Together, these 5 BRICS countries make up 40% of the world's population, 25% of the world's landmass, and almost 30% of the global GDP. Now, while you might be thinking, this BRICS summit sounds like the most boring meeting on earth, fortunately, state-run China Central Television knows how to make it cool, with a Fast and Furious-style death race on a volcano. The meeting faces many challenges, like dangerous roads, lava explosions, and electric rocks shaped like letters. But when the road starts to crumble underneath them, these 5 rivals will join together and accomplish the impossible: jumping over a cliff. Wow, the BRICS summit must be so cool! Let's take a look at the actual footage. Almost as cool? Now I understand why CCTV did that animation. So, what did the real-life versions of those race car drivers discuss during their 3-day extravaganza? One thing, as I mentioned earlier in the broadcast, is that they're all angry at North Korea for trying to upstage their party with a nuclear test. But looming over the 3-day summit was the intense rivalry smoldering between the 2 biggest countries, India and China. For about 70 days, India and China were locked in a serious border dispute that threatened to turn into a full-blown war. And by threatened, I mean Chinese state-run media was threatening war. And that was just a symptom of much deeper tensions between the 2 nations. The dispute was eventually resolved, with both sides saving face just in time for the BRICS summit. And the 2 leaders both seemed amicable enough. But things are far from smooth between India and China. They're still economic and political rivals. Oh, and military rivals. On the Friday before the summit, China held live fire drills in the Indian Ocean, or as the Chinese Communist Party calls it, the Southwest China Sea. I'm just kidding. I think. But speaking of territorial disputes, those also made their way into the summit. Xi Jinping was pushing his One Belt, One Road initiative. He says it will link China and the rest of Eurasia together for mutual economic prosperity and high-speed car chases. But India considers it a debt-fueled disaster that will see China surrounding India and threatening its sovereignty. A huge part of the plan involves the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which would go through territory that India disputes with Pakistan. Pakistan is, of course, a major rival to India over more than just territory. India considers Pakistan a source of terrorism. Yes, terrorism. That's another point that China and India square off over. Since China is pretty buddy-buddy with Pakistan, the Chinese regime has used its spot as permanent member on the UN Security Council to block India's attempts to have the leader of the Pakistan-based terrorist group, Jaish-e-Mohammed, put on a terror blacklist. Yes, China has blocked the leader of a terrorist organization from being labeled a terrorist. But India won a round on that front at the BRICS summit. In the 43-page joint statement put out during the summit, tackling terrorism was a key point. And it specifically called out Pakistan-based groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed alongside ISIS and Al-Qaeda. That may put a strain on China-Pakistan ties. Another reason the Chinese regime is concerned about India is its ties to the United States. Beijing is leery of being surrounded by U.S. allies like South Korea, Japan, and India. So smoothing over recent tensions to ensure India came to BRICS is part of a long-term plan to make India and all the other countries more reliant on China instead of the West. A big part of that is the New Development Bank. It was started 2 years ago by the BRICS countries. The idea is to rival the World Bank and the IMF. The New Development Bank is equally funded by all 5 BRICS countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. and will offer loans for projects in those countries, without all the strings attached that Western countries tend to add, worthless strings like government transparency and human rights. The new development bank is probably the most concrete thing to come out of the BRICS summit in recent years. Each country has pledged $10 billion to it so far. The first project it funded is a solar energy plant in China. And one of the next projects it will fund is a drinking water system in rural India. Of course, China's $10 billion investment in the new development bank is small compared to the $120 billion Xi Jinping pledged to his One Belt, One Road initiative back in May. So he's still giving priority to that. But as much as the Chinese regime would like India to become economically dependent on China, the plan may have backfired a bit. Because while Xi's back was turned, these two got to talking on the sidelines. Modi and Putin got to talking about their own trade and investment deals. And that was after the two signed defense and energy deals worth billions last October. I mean, Putin, whose side are you on? Look, Xi Jinping just wanted to put on a good party. And of course, the US wasn't invited. There was a Chinese opera set in what looks suspiciously like China's sacred territory in the South China Sea. Putin seems uncomfortable. There was even pie, or at least metaphors about pie.
The development of emerging markets and developing countries won't touch anyone's cheese, but will instead diligently grow the world's economic pie.
What's with the cheese thing? Has Xi Jinping been reading self-help books again?
We will grow the world economic pie by manifesting it through the law of attraction of the universe. Visualize the pie, the big cheese pie.
Oh no, he's moved on to the secret. No one show him the power of now. But overall, relations between India and China are better than they were during the recent military standoff. At the same time, India is still suspicious of what China has to offer. And that might mean Team BRICS will never make it to the top of Volcano Mountain. But at least they'll always have a big cheese pie. And coming up after the break, the Chinese Communist Party is being threatened by ISIS, which makes this whole India rivalry look like a playground scuffle. Hey, if you really want to smile, get on over to ChinaUncensored.tv. There, you'll see loads more China Uncensored you won't see anywhere else, including full half-hour episodes, and you don't even have to pay for it. However, if you'd like to support China Uncensored, also make a trip to the website patreon.com/ChinaUncensored, where you can contribute to the show. That would make me smile.